Okay, this is the second segment um, in the introduction to complex societal systems approach to research and the analysis of human behavior. Firstly, we need to keep in mind that the importance of circumstantial context when we're dealing with societal systems. I refer the reader to Jared Diamond's treatment of the importance of circumstances in social differences that he lays out in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel. But what differentiates developed or more developed, more complex societal systems really is the nature of their circumstantial context. What makes analysis possible, given these differences, are the commonalities that can be found in all societal systems. And this is what we're going to emphasize in this sequence of models and talks to get through and explain the holistic nature of the complex societal systems approach. One thing to keep in mind from an intellectual basis, that this approach is based on intellectual complementarity rather than contrasting and opposing ideologies. The one basic premise from an intellectual point of view is that all of the great writings and all of the great thinkings and all of the ideologies that have emerged and been articulated in the course of human history contain truth. That none of them are completely true. That means that the contrasting or competing ideologies do not contain the core of truth itself, but pieces of the truth. And we learn from comparing and contrasting these different perspectives that are contained in these different theories and ideological tracks. So to say that this is rational or rational choice or idealistic or neo-idealistic or communistic or some other intellectual approach is missing the point. That it borrows from all of these attempts to articulate a better understanding of the human condition and tries to find a commonality not only amongst social systems but amongst perspectives and attempts to articulate perspectives on these social systems. And so you'll see elements of all of these different intellectual traditions in the work itself. And we'll try and point these out at various locations when it's appropriate. Thirdly, the approach is essentially macro-comparative. It's not strictly quantitative. It combines both qualitative and quantitative. The quantitative basis is in the commonalities. The qualitative basis, of course, deals with the differences. And so in understanding societal systems, one has to start out with the commonalities in order to better understand the differences. And that's what the essence of this approach is attempting to do, is to point out the commonalities so that the differences are not divisive in such, but are merely indicative of the diversity of the human condition. And the diversity largely stems from the diversity of circumstantial contexts in which human societies have emerged and developed. What it is leaning towards is establishing at least the basis for a unified theory of societal systems analysis. So, the starting point is basically the ending point. And so we're going to present this approach and the explanation of the approach in a circular fashion. We're going to start out with the most complex model and then deconstruct it into its basic units and then put them back together so that we can better understand the complexities. If we try and deal with complexities up front, we'll get into an endless, infinite stream of connections and interconnections and parts and pieces that will totally negate any continuity or coherence to the approach. What we want to do is understand basically the skeletal structure of commonalities so that we can better place the differences. So, what I've developed over the course of this time is what I call the societal systems model. And the computer screen here and the supporting diagrams that will be interposed within this narrative illustrate this model. And the model itself is somewhat handicapped by our abilities to present complex information. We are kind of stuck in a two-dimensional space when we articulate ideas. We're moving more towards a four-dimensional space, and we're going to try and incorporate at least the ideas of four-dimensional space into the explanation, but we're going to rely on the audience to use their imagination for the most part in imposing these extra dimensions to the explanation. What we see is a two-dimensional object, and it looks like an eyeball. And the iris of the eyeball is the state, or the pupil, I guess. The pupil of the eyeball is the state. The iris are the elites. And then we have the rest of the eyeball, the aqueous humor, if you will, of civil society and marginal sector groups. Of course, the state and the elites are the best organized and the best institutionalized. And the degree of organization and institutionalization varies within this sphere of political relevance and political influence, the political space model. And this is what this is. This is how groups are arranged in relationship to one another in a complex societal system. The model also situates the societal system within its larger circumstantial context or neighborhood, where it interacts with other societal systems. In the diagram, these external interactions and influences are represented as network linkages with other states, these acting as the official representatives of other groups, interests and objectives, and NGOs and TANs, which stands for non-governmental organizations and transnational advocacy networks, which represent civil society groups with broader systemic interests and objectives. The things that this model emphasizes, of course, is complexity. One also has to keep in mind that this is not a two-dimensional model, this is a four-dimensional model. And the added dimensions, the ones that one would have to imagine in using this type of presentational scheme, is that this sphere of political space is actually a sphere. It's not a circle. That it is like an eyeball, that it does have substance, and that there are more groups of smaller nature than there are of larger nature, and that's why it is a sphere with smaller groups but more powerful groups on one end, and a greater disorganization at the opposite end. This will relate to what we will get into next with the individual models, in that the marginal sectors are what we will later discuss as the reactive sector of societal systems. The state represents, in the traditional sense, the active form, but the act of democratization, the progress of societal development, moves the locus of authority in a societal system from the active to the proactive sector. And we'll talk more about this when we get into the what I call the aggregate individual, or the social identity group model. But for the complex societal system, we see the various components that comprise complex societal systems, which give it coherence, cohesion, and persistence over time. And these three things are the state, civil society, and then the marginal sector. The marginal sectors are often referred to as the outgroups. They're discriminated groups, the groups that are not fully integrated into the societal system. They have marginal interaction, especially with the state, and they often see themselves at cross purposes with the state, and they often will express their views in anti-state sentiments. Civil society, on the other hand, is more complexly organized amongst professional, personal, and recreational, trade types of associations. Complex societal systems really require that individuals organize into units, whether they're administrative units, cities, counties, states, other political administrative units, whether they are economic enterprises, corporations, businesses, small shops, anything that organizes people to common purpose. And so a modern complex societal system will contain literally hundreds of thousands or even millions of social identity groups within it. But these are not organized haphazardly or disconnectedly. There's a coherence and a cohesion, and this is done by communication networks amongst these social units, that they regularly interact, that they are aware of each other, that they actually form cooperative relationships with each other depending on what the goals of the groups are. If they come into congruence, they work together. If they're working on something that's specific to the group, they work separately. But over time, they learn who they have common purpose with, who they have a commonality of interest with, and they form social networks based on this knowledge of special interests, common interests, and then of course their relationship with political administration. The political administration itself tends to need to organize social groups in a coherent function so that larger order enterprises can be conducted in order to facilitate the formation of social identity groups, civil society groups, to facilitate their interaction and facilitate the potential for their cooperation into larger enterprises. Often this is done through taxation, but it's often done by actually integrating these groups into the public enterprise. And so the public space, the private space are fully integrated in the modern complex societal system. When they're not fully integrated, we see the societal system to be at lower levels of development. And so it's a progressive ordering of society to give it a greater capacity to function and to manage its own condition given its circumstantial context. One thing I want to reemphasize in talking about this model of a modern complex societal system is that it's greatly simplified, even though it looks very complex, and especially in terms of articulating its features, discussing its parts. It would lead to a very complex explanation and elicit more questions than it could possibly deal with. And this is what we have to contend with in modern societal systems. Basically, information overload. Not only information overload, but administrative overload. We've developed over time very dense interactive networks of associations and linkages and administrative units to help us contend with the sheer magnitude of activities, relationships, communications that go on a daily basis, on a minute-by-minute basis in complex societal systems. We tend to overlook a lot of this activity and focus on only those that involve us personally as a way to manage this overload of information and activity. But these things are going on. And in order to talk about it in the whole, in a comprehensive way, we'd have to talk about everything, which is absolutely overloads our ability to communicate. So what we're going to focus on is a simplified model, and this is greatly simplified, as I've already stated. It's going to look at basic structures that are common amongst societal systems, talk about the position of the state, the relationship of the state with the other societal sectors, the civil society and the marginal sectors, recognizing that the civil society is, by its construction and its relationship with the state, it is integrated with the state. Members of civil society have a stake in the maintenance of the societal system. On the other hand, in contrast, the marginal sectors have minimal interaction with the state, have minimal stake in maintenance of the system as defined by the state and the policies that the state adopts, and often engages in anti-state or anti-system rhetoric, which reflects its own sense of a marginalized condition within the societal system and its lack of stake in maintenance of the system and its lack of integration with the other actors in the system. What counterpoises the state in this setup is seen in the red in this model. The alternative state, that in the marginal sector, as it lacks stake in maintaining the system, it actually sees itself better off often in actually dissociating itself from the state and forming its own organizational structure. And these organizational structures can be ethnic organizations or religious organizations. And the nature of these organizations really determine the size, their coherence, and their continuity in organizing the marginal sectors. In this particular model, we have a single alternative state that does organize the marginal sectors and does compete with the traditional state or the political state in exercising authority over the marginal sectors. And it probably has more legitimate authority in the marginal sectors than the political state does. What keeps this thing, of course, congruent as a whole is that the marginal sectors lack the capacity to actually challenge the authority of the state. And if they are in a weaker position, if they lack opportunity to challenge the state, they will coexist with the state even though they don't see a net benefit from association with the state. They remain dormant or latent in their opposition to the state. What in modern societal systems brings the marginal sectors in incrementally is their association with civil society. The marginal sectors do have regular and structured interactions with civil society groups. And so in the complex modern societal system, civil society is actually a mediating sector of the political space, whereas the groups not only are integrated and interact regularly with elite structures, with the political structures of the state, they also interact regularly with the marginal sectors, whether they employ them, whether they're interacting them socially or culturally, if they share values with them. There is a communication linkage that goes throughout this political space, but it's often segmented and often disjointed or even disconnected. And these are the types of problems that then give rise to incentives for more coercive relationships. So in a perfectly harmonious societal system, associational strategies tend to define the majority of social relationships. Coercive strategies are minimalized. When there are problems with the flow of information, with the network of social interactions and associations, coercion tends to arise as an alternative way of resolving differences, and so we see an increase in coercive strategies. At some point, these can escalate into violence. And so the basic premise of the analysis of complex societal systems is that the only true way to understand the performance of the system is to measure the amounts of coercion and political violence within the system. This is the best gauge of telling whether the societal system is operating well, whether it's fully or only partially integrated, whether there are impediments to a free flow of information and association, and whether we should pay attention to correcting these problems, these insufficiencies, these unresolved differences. In looking at this, we also need to keep in mind that modern complex societal systems are often bifurcated into multiple groups, and so there can be competing centers for marginal organization. And when there are competing centers, these are often come to be understood as ethnic groups or regional groups, regions that feel that they have no strong connection to the center, the central authorities. And we often see their political activity as anti-state on the one hand, but also separatist. Rather than having an incentive to change the nature of the system because they see no benefit personally from the system as it stands, they tend to want to form an alternative system and then separate and even secede from the political space that's defined by a central authority. And so we have not only revolutionary potential but separatist potential within the complex societal system.